And then we were eventually acquired in 2020 to the parent company of eHarmony in a $500 million deal. And so that brought us back private. And so I left in 2023. People that were there for a very long time, we had fantastic retention, especially compared to tech industry. And I think part of it was people were respected and everyone had this curiosity, wanting to learn, wanting to be working on the next cutting edge things. And so I think that's why we kind of grew together. And so all through all these different phases of the company, we had our team to really rely on and really be supported by.
Hello, marginal listeners. I'm so glad to have you back with us this week. I hope everyone's taking care of themselves this week. And if you're really looking for an inspiring conversation full of heart, we have the episode for you. This week, I sit down with Connelly. My trip to her offices at 25 was one of my first business trips ever. And the kindness and authenticity she met me with then is still absolutely true to this day, as is evidenced by our conversation. Catherine is incredibly decorated. She co-founded my yearbook at the age of 15 and grew it to become The Meet Group, a NASDAQ-listed dating and live streaming company. In our episode, Catherine talks about launching her startup in high school and the challenges of entering the public sector at such a young age. She speaks to the many evolutions of my yearbook, leading up to a $500 million sale in 2020, and how, throughout it all, people always remained core to her company's success. We also cover themes from her brand new book, including how kindness has a way of coming back around and how accessibility for one group actually doesn't mean sacrifice for another. If you're interested in designing a life you actually want, give this episode a listen and then be sure to pick up Catherine's new book, Designing Success: Lessons from 20 Years as a Female Tech Entrepreneur. The book is available in paperback this week, and you can find it online anywhere you buy books. So with that, let's get into it. Catherine, it's so good to be here with you today.
Great to be here with you too. Thanks for having me, Abby.
Of course. This is very bizarre because we actually go pretty far back, not to date ourselves, but I always like to talk about when I first meet people, and with you it's a particularly special story because I think I was maybe 25 years old and I was working at one of my first ad tech startups. And it's funny because at the time I was taking business trips, but the majority of my business trips were to Israel. Of all places. I didn't take a lot of domestic
Right.
business trips. And at the time, you were, I think at that time, your company had been integrated into the Meet Group,
Mhm.
and you were in Pennsylvania and you were a client, and I set out to go on a business trip to meet you in person. And it was a very big deal for me because I believe that was the first time I was on a train. Again, I had flown cross country. I don't know that I had been on a train. So the
Right.
chronology here doesn't really
And
make
and to
sense.
like New Hope, Pennsylvania was where the company was located. So, you're coming from, West Coast. We're not in New York. If you fly into New York or Newark or, Philly, either way, you're getting on a train. The train an hour. And then the office was like at least 30 minutes.
You know what I'm just remembering now? There was one Uber driver in all of New Hope, Pennsylvania, because that Uber driver was the Uber driver who drove me from the train station to my hotel and then from my hotel to your offices. And it was the same person
Yeah.
every time. And I said, "How many of there are you?" And he's like, "I don't know. Apparently not very many." We were on a first name basis by the end of the trip. But yeah, it is not the normal business trip destination. But yeah, I met you there. The only way I can describe it is you were just so kind
Yeah.
because as a vendor, you go on a lot of business trips and you meet with a lot of clients, and clients, especially in the industry we were in, a lot of clients know that vendors whining and dining them is kind of a perk. And particularly in our industry, there weren't a lot of perks associated with some of those jobs. So I do feel like some of the people who worked with media companies took advantage, right?
Mhm.
And not even just racking up huge bills, but also really treating us as though we were vendors, like kind of othering us, right? Like
Mhm.
I would sometimes get the feeling like I was there in service of them. And I just distinctly remember when I met with you, I felt like I was not being treated like a vendor. I was being treated like a person.
Well, I aim to treat all people like people. But what was also lovely when you visit us is we so rarely got visitors because we're so off the beaten path. And it was like, I'm coming here? Like, that's fantastic. It was mutual.
Yeah, I just remember I think it was around the time you were getting married or you had just gotten married. And when we were at lunch, you were telling me how you met your husband.
Uh,
And it just felt like two human people having a conversation. And sad to say that was not the standard for a lot of my business meetings. So it just stuck so prominently in my mind. I figured it was worth sharing. And then that theme of kindness, I think, is really pervasive because in all honesty, when I first started this podcast, one of my first kind of pie in the sky guests that I thought of was you, but you're an incredibly big deal. And I know that you probably won't say it, so I'll be the one to say it. You've had an incredibly successful exit. You sold your first startup to the Meat Group. And while I had idealized having you on the show, I figured Catherine's kind of the big leagues now. Surely she wouldn't want to be on a show like this. And you have been one of the biggest supporters of the show since day one. So you have such an acute ability to just really reach out to people and touch them on such a personal level, no matter what level you're operating from. So I had to speak to that because I feel like for those who don't already know you, that is such a defining quality of who Catherine is and has always been.
Thank you.
Oh, good. You're
You're so,
crying. This
you're
is
so sweet.
exactly what.
You're so
Oh, no.
sweet. No, and thank you so much. And I've been absolutely loving the podcast, as I think that is something I want to put out in the world as I do try to be kind and do try to, celebrate the achievements of others because I think that, that's how we draw each other closer. That's the best way to go through the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you've even, mentioned being kind to people actually, it does not that this is why you should do it, but it does have a way of coming back around,
It
right?
does.
You do find serendipity and kind of these odd coincidences when you make really meaningful connections with people that are true connections. Somehow they have a way of working to your advantage later on.
Right, and I think that that's, so my brother Jeff, who I started my company with, he likes to quote the poet Rilke, and one of his poems is like talks about fighting heartlessly, and really that's how our we were able to really navigate our space for as long as we did. So we were at the Meet Group for the whole story, but like for 18 years, and in order to basically survive your board and investors long enough to be, running a company for 18 years in order to have other people in your industries. Because at the end of our run at the Meat Group, we were doing, lots of B2B deals. And those types of relationships came up because we were able to just reach out, pick up the phone and talk to people in the industry and they thought highly of us. And so being able to, kind of have that in the world means that you create your own luck because when you're connecting with people in a real way, in an authentic way, and in a fair way, and you're also not being like full of yourself or puffed up or just if you're not being heated, if you're being completely, rational and all of that, people want to continue to work for you. And what you see is all of our careers are, long enough for this relationships to reverse multiple times. And so what you see is that the actions you make leave a wake. And you want to be aware of that as you're thinking like when you get that rude email, do you fire off the first thing you think, for instance? And I think that that was something that we were always very good at, like being like, oh, let's take a moment, let's regroup and just stay in like that calm, rational mode. Cause that's how we were able to build the company for as long as we did.
Yeah. And it's a differentiating factor, right? People, investors, they're working with companies like this all the time. And if they remember you as the one that didn't meet them with that level of energy, it is kind of a competitive differentiator. So I can completely, having worked with a lot of different founder communities, I can definitely see how that would make you stand out in a good way. But so you mentioned starting the company with your brother. I would love to get into the humble beginnings of your startup, where it started, with whom it started. If you could take us all the way back and, yeah, tell us the origin story of your startup.
The company's name was originally My Yearbook, and we got started in 2005. So I was 15. I was a sophomore in high school. My brother Dave was 16. He was a junior in high school. And Dave and I were talking, we were relatively new in our high school. And so, we're trying to meet friends. And we're like, wouldn't it be interesting if we put yearbooks online? And so that's how the idea of my yearbook was born. It was just like, okay, well, sure. Why don't we just build this? And I guess I should actually backtrack a little bit further because that's already kind of crazy. The 15 and 16-year-old are just kind of like, we can make that. But the reason that we had that kind of well, partially ridiculous naivety, but but that's
Mhm.
ridiculous. Like, oh, we can do this. Was because growing up, we watched our brother Jeff, who's about 10 years older than Dave, start and sell his first company. And he started it when he was at Harvard. And when he graduated, he moved to an office and he moved out west, and we would visit him during the summers. Our parents would just ship us off there for a few weeks in the summer to hang out there. And, so we were familiar with stars. We were familiar with this energy, with this just it was so different than like bring your kids to work day with that we would go to with our parents. We're like, oh, we want to do this. And so when Dave and I got the idea, we knew that entrepreneurship was an option, which, most kids don't. I think now maybe they do a little bit more, but seriously, most kids don't. They have so many other things on their minds. Rightfully so. And I think that, being able to just say, okay, well, all right, well, how do we do this? And so we pitched the idea to Jeff over dinner. We're having like chicken cutlets, and we're like, so we have this idea for a company. And he loved it. He was actually aware of Facebook. Being Harvard alum, he was aware of Facebook, and they were only in a few schools at the time. And he was like, okay, he's like, I understand how this could work. And he wanted to join us. And so then it was the three of us. His first company was essay and resume editing. So not really in this thing. So we did a lot of Googling, where we found Google to really be the age equalizer, because I think as we're building, we weren't in any way qualified. We had MySpace accounts, which again, mid aughts, that's what you had. I had a Zanga. That's just what we used. So it's not like we had any like special development skills. None of us code or anything like that. But we were curious enough, and we knew that we could, and scrappy enough that we're like, okay, let's find out how to do this. Let's Google all the questions we have. We found a development team using eLamps, and they were based out of Mumbai. And so we would send them hundreds of pages of specification sheets, just like pen on paper wireframes, detailing and illustrating like everything the site would have and what it would do. Which in 2005, every site was doing everything, so it was a lot. And we were, so we would be sending them to our developers, chatting with them until, sometimes 2, 3 in the morning. We'll still have to get up for 7:30 in the morning homeroom at our high school. I could not do that today. Be up until 3 a.m. and then repeatedly get up at 7:30 and be a functioning human being. So I think being young definitely had its own superpower there. That's how it started. So we got our first, few hundred members to join from our high school. We wore fun shirts to school every day that said things like, answering the questions that matter most. Who are your friends' friends? And are they hot? Silly things, but cheeky, because, high school. And we ended up continuously, getting people from our school to join. And what was fantastic, what we knew was like actually working when it clicked, was when people were coming up to us in the cafeteria around the track and saying, hey, I joined my yearbook. This is what I think you should add. And it was like, this is like what we're building as like high school. And that was really cool, because it became like kind of like our high school thing, our project. And, it was clearly resonating with the other students. So we were able to open it up to all schools. We didn't have a huge advertising budget, obviously. So what we ended up doing was we had a bunch of user generated quizzes and on like layout things and like glitter letter generators and silly things like that, but people used all the time on MySpace. And
Yep.
we had a huge stock of them, and when we created those. And so when people would take a quiz before they would get their quiz results, so it'd be like, what friend's character are you? And then we would take a registration screen, and they could skip it, but a lot of people registered. And then they would share their quiz results on their AIM profiles, on their Zanga. And that's how we took advantage of the viral channels at the time, and ended up getting our first million members within 9 months. And so of launching to all schools. And so it was like insane growth very quickly, very lucky in sense of like right idea at the right time with an execution that happened to work. And I think that as we were building, then that's when we finally opened our office. So all that time we didn't have an office, and then we opened it after we got our first million members in 2006, and that's when we had been located in New Hope, Pennsylvania, that whole time.
Wow. Okay. So just to go back to the very inception of this all, you talked about how your oldest brother was an entrepreneur. So he was already in the startup realm. And because of that reason, you and your younger brother, well, still older than you, but younger than your eldest brother, knew that this was even a possibility. And I think that's so, so key, because that is a taken for granted thing that most of us don't have. There is this theme of founders who believe at a very young age that they could build their own business are usually, they have a sibling who's done it, or they have parents who are entrepreneurs. And I just think it's a really important call out, because had you not had the brother you had. And also, had you not had the parents you had, because I'm sure that your parents saw your brother do it successfully, that made them feel more comfortable having you and your other brother do it. They saw the potential upside. They saw what this could look like. And for a lot of us now, I mean, I'll speak to it. My parents are still a little bit nervous about some of the entrepreneurial endeavors because they've largely worked for, particularly my dad, worked for other people. So having somebody within your inner circle take the first step makes such a marked impact on everybody else in their lives. Modeling that this is even a feasibility to start your own company creates so much access for everybody else that's surrounding them.
For sure. And the easiest way to know that you can do something is definitely seeing someone has done it before. And it's not just we saw like he had a successful exit, but we also saw the rest of it along the way. Like we saw him on family vacations having to be at an internet cafe the whole time because something was happening with his company. So we saw like, the hard things as well. I think that that also helped because like when we got into it, we knew this is going to be a lot of work, but you get through it, you do the next thing. And to what you were saying about my parents, for sure. I'm a mom now. My kids are younger; they're almost 5 and almost 2. But the idea of like Dave and I were young, and we're talking throughout the night while school's going on, and like my parents are just allowing it because they know
Yeah.
what we're doing. Obviously, that takes a lot of trust from your parents too to realize they're building something they believe in, and to still support it from that point is huge. And I know we're going to dive into this more, but I think it's also, very relevant that my mom, she's was one of the few women in her field. So when she went to college, which was after she had my brother, so like she, didn't go right after high school. She went back to school to become an electrical engineer. So I always had that message from her too, that it's like you can do whatever you want, basically. And also the other lesson from her was she liked the idea of entrepreneurship because she always had something to say about her bosses.
It's funny. I've spoken with my co-founder about this, Brian, because he had a business in high school. He ultimately ended up dropping out of high school, but we've met other entrepreneurs too who they had businesses in high school, much like you. And a lot of times their parents would discourage that because having a business in high school is a distraction from getting good grades in high school, which will then get you into a good college, which will then probably get you the corporate job, which, as far as our parents were concerned, was the ideal pipeline. So it's so cool that your parents, in all honesty, you staying up until the wee hours of the morning could have taken a toll on the grade you got in your quiz the next day. But they wanted to encourage you to go in the direction of where you were passionate, even if it was a little bit at odds with following this very traditional path of, and I'm sure you probably still got great grades in high school knowing what I know
Did.
about you. But maybe it would have been a little less palatable if it was really cannibalizing your grades. But still, the fact that your parents didn't see it as a perceived threat at all I think it just created so many opportunities for you and your brother that isn't really the standard. So that's incredible that your parents were able to be that for you.
And also, when you're a teenage entrepreneur, there's a lot of work your parents have to do that like is unusual. I remember we had like a press interview, and like you don't always like know right away. I can't remember. Might have been Cosmo Girl or something, but they were doing like photo shoot at the house, and my mom's like, "So I have to leave work early and clean the house." Things that I didn't have a driver's license, so she was driving us places. Like there was, so many things like that that like your parents' support in little and big ways obviously made a huge difference for me being able to keep building. And that was true when I went to college too. It's because, obviously then you're out of your parents' home, but I'm in college. And the very first thing, like seriously, first class, I found out that my midterm was going to conflict with some planned travel I had. I was asked to speak at the World Knowledge Forum in South Korea. Kind of was kind of a big deal. And it conflicted with the midterm. That professor, first day of class, going through the syllabus, was like, if you're going to miss the midterm, you should drop out, drop this class, not drop out. And there'll be no exceptions. And so, of course, I'm like, come to him, like, hi, I'm just going to be missing the midterm, but, and explaining my situation. And he was so excited to support me. He was just so supportive, so happy for me, and was like, "I'm happy to take it early." And I wanted to be clear, like, I do need a special circumstance, but I'm not trying to get one over on you, basically.
Right. You weren't trying to get out of it.
Right.
Hmm.
I was like, I will do it. I took the exam when I came back. It was fine. And, and he was, so immensely supportive and just continued throughout my time in college. One of my mentors I had my sophomore year, actually I had her for 3 classes. And she was always incredibly supportive of like what I was building, what I needed. And it just made it so that it was kind of a safe place to ask for help and to feel like you're going to have that support. And I know how lucky I was because going through this, I did have other young entrepreneur friends who were like in the same exact life stage, which is also nice. But and I was connecting with one of them recently, and she said so when she was in college, she had the same experience where like most professors were more than happy to help accommodate her to help her build something, except for one professor who happened to be a social entrepreneurship professor. But
Well, wait, let's dig into that a
yeah,
little bit more. I think that's really interesting, because you would think that being an entrepreneur, other entrepreneurs would support you, or being somebody in a startup, other people in that startup would support you. But I mean, I've spoken firsthand about my experiences. Startups, by nature of being really small and being very under resourced and being very competitive, I feel like a lot of people are operating from a place of scarcity. And
yeah,
I feel like I've had even female managers who felt that they couldn't stick their necks out for me because it would put them in a vulnerable position because they were the only other female in the organization. So it maybe it's not, it's not just a coincidence. I don't know. I don't want to project too much onto this
right.
professor. I know nothing about him, but it's not the first time I've heard of somebody within this network of startup culture not advocating for others. Let's just put it that way.
For sure, for sure. And yeah, and like I said, I don't know anything about that professor either, so I don't know if he what was going on there. But it is interesting, and your experience is totally resonates with so many people who have had that seriously where someone just isn't they're not willing to put your neck out, and I totally agree. That scarcity is a huge part of that, especially when it comes to getting funding and things like that. Like you want to be supporting people, you also, but at the same time you realize it's like, oh, well, if like there's only this much money, it's like, who am I coming to get it? And so you definitely start to see that. Luckily, though, I've had in my own experience just so many supportive people. And there's been like, and I feel like most of the negative things, unfortunately, have been from either completely outsiders or just like they didn't mean to. Like a microaggression, like it's like I didn't realize I was making this difficult. When I went to college, I was actually originally kind of keeping my yearbook as my secret double life because in high school I actually did get a fair amount of negativity from my peers, which my brother Dave didn't. And I will say Dave is significantly cooler than me, so that maybe plays a part. But with that said, I remember I was on CNBC and my teacher turned it on in the classroom because he was proud of me. He's like, and it had been taped earlier, I think that day, and he was put it on. The first thing I had was one of the students next to me saying, "Wow, you look really fat on TV." So that was mean. And it was just one of those things of ways to put someone down. I had another situation where we're Spanish class, and this was completely unprompted. The kid in front of me just turns around and says, "You're making us all look bad." And it wasn't making him look bad in Spanish because like I was not very good at Spanish. So it was not about the
Yeah.
it was things like that. Or I was applying for a scholarship, and one of the girls in my class heard that, and she said that wasn't appropriate because I had this business, and that's it's not okay to also look for academic scholarships. So I had just like these like little comments, but I think as humans we hear the negativity and we keep track of it, and might keep track of it far more than we keep track of the positive. I do this. I'm a jerk. When people say like nice things, or like when teachers would like write a nice note on a paper, I totally saved that. Because
Yeah.
sometimes it's just nice to like, look through and be like, oh wait, I do know what I'm doing. But so when I went into college, I was afraid of having that same negative reaction because unfortunately, as women, success and likability are negatively correlated. I was concerned about that. And actually, going into college, there was a negative article about me in one of the Georgetown owned publications that wasn't Georgetown owned student publications, but it was just one of those things where I was like, maybe I should keep this to myself a little bit.
Mm.
And it wasn't actually until, and I mentioned my mentor earlier, that teacher kind of almost outed me in the classroom because she was just like, hey, tell us about it. And that's when I started actually talking about it to my peers as well as, the professors I had to ask for help. And it just made it was just a completely different experience. Peers were so supportive. They thought it was cool. They were like, wow, you're building this. That's amazing.
I mean, let's be honest, when you're in high school, you're just insecure. That
Yeah.
is such a foundational period in your development where you're coming into your own, and we're all operating from a place of scarcity regardless of how well resourced we are. Like, we all have this perceived idea that everything is kind of a zero sum game, and if somebody else succeeds, it's going to cannibalize or create loss for somebody else, especially when you're going through puberty and everybody's trying to find their footing. It does become just more of a combative place. And maybe what we see is when we grow up a little bit and our frontal lobe is a little more developed. I don't know. I'm speaking completely out of turn. I should have my husband talking about this as an educator and not myself. But I don't know, maybe there's just a maturity element to it too. When you're in college, seeing somebody else really successful creates more of an abundance mindset, right? Oh, Catherine's able to do this and she's in my class. This girl in my class was on CNBC. Maybe that means I could one day be on CNBC. So, kind of like a little bit of that reframe that just happens with growing up a little bit. Maybe there's something to it.
I think there's something to be said about growing up a little bit, but I also think there's something to be said about when you're in college, being able to choose who you associate with in a way that you're not as able to do in high school, where your main affinity towards people might be a zip code. When you're in college and taking the same courses, there's usually a little bit more that kind of has that reaction. Cause I think it's so a huge part of it is growing up, yes. But I think like part of it too is just at that point in my career, I had already started to choose the people who were supportive and look for
Mhm.
that and not try to be, oh, someone's saying something negative about me. Well, I'm going to go talk to this person instead. And
Yep.
I think that that's tough because I think adults do it too. Adults sometimes put other people down for their successes or just think, okay, well, if we're both going for this job, then I'm going to try to do something to hurt this other person's chances. That happens. That always happens.
Yeah.
And I think being able to navigate how you want to go around the world will be figuring out how to surround yourself with the right people who are supportive of you. Because it is a skill where I think it takes some training to develop because people go into situations they want to be liked and that might mean connecting with someone who what you shouldn't care if they like you and I think that's difficult because there's a kind of like a natural tendency to want to like please someone. You should go into things assuming people like you because you want to have like that. There's like that whole acceptance prophecy where if you assume people like you, they'll be more likely to like you because you're probably approaching the situation from like a, more warm, more friendly yourself. But you shouldn't want to be liked just because you want to be liked. You should be want to be liked for who you are as a person, for things that you actually value. And then keep that in mind with the other people you're connecting with too. Cause I think that that's, one of the things that's like the people I was surrounded with at the company, we had an amazing team. And I'm so blessed that I got to work with them. That was so privileged. Like, obviously I love working with my brother, but throughout the company, it was just the kindest people. Cause I remember coming home from college one summer. So the summers would be the time where I'd be there for like the full stretch. Otherwise, it's mostly doing things remotely. And because of that, especially as we hired a lot more people after our Series B, like there was a lot of people I didn't know other than exchanging emails with or being on a call with. And, at the time, we weren't really doing video calls. It was actually a phone call because I didn't even have Wi-Fi in my dorm. So even like coming back to the office, it's like, oh, this is weird. I don't know as many people as I should. And I remember one of our database administrators, he sees this and he's like, Catherine, come to Dunkin' Donuts with us. And so it became a thing. It's like at that time, I'd go to the Dunkin' Donuts with all of the DBAs and it was fantastic. And I got to know them well, but it takes that. And that's a relatively small action of just saying, hey, come get coffee with us. Come with us. But like being able to make that invitation, being able to like show up for someone who, I'm sure he realized that I was feeling a little lonely because I'm also significantly younger than everyone there and welcoming me in. And so that was just something that the company did. I was just surrounded by good people. And so and I think that kind of shows in how I navigate like the company's growth and stuff is like, we had a very respectful team and a very good team. And I think that is why we were able to accomplish so much together and wanted to continue to work together.
Yeah, I think it's a really underestimated thing. I think we are all people-based businesses, and I see a lot of startups not prioritizing people, but prioritizing ideas and skills that lend themselves to certain ideas. But Especially early stage founders, don't get attached to ideas because they're likely going to change. I mean, Catherine's story is a little anomalous. The fact that you launched something and that thing is what became incredibly successful. A lot of early stage founders need to pivot and try on different ideas. And, I think one of the things that I always say is what is pervasive is the people you're building with, and the why behind the products that you're building. And if you're not really intentional about the people that you invite into your company, the investors that you bring onto your cap table to invest in your company, that could cause a huge detriment to the success of your startup. And I think it is such an underrated thing that not enough people are talking about. So I'm so glad you bring it up.
Yeah. Though I will say we actually did pivot a ton.
You did? Okay, tell me
Yeah.
more.
So when we first like the initial idea was basically doing Facebook for high school students. That didn't last into like a month into launch, basically. So then we became about meeting new people, and that we did stay with. So we stayed as for my yearbook, which again, the name not really about meeting new people, but we stuck with the name until 2011. We went public in a SPAC like deal with the company was Kpasta. We merged with this $100 million deal. We were bringing basically all the revenue to the deal, and now we had these two brands, My Yearbook and Kpasta, and then we're like, okay, let's be called Meet Me now because we're about meeting new people. And the name My Yearbook didn't make sense. So obviously we tested it with our users. We figured out how to rebrand, which is a whole thing. But then that kind of entered this Meet Me era where now we're primarily a mobile app. We started as web. I mentioned how busy the homepage was. So we launched on because like the mid odds. But now, 2010, 2012, when we were developing mobile app, we had to be very choosy with what stuff we got rid of. And so it was a completely different company in that sense. And now, of course, we had Android teams and iPhone teams and all that as well. Then we're Meet Me for a while, primarily ad based. The ad market started doing poorly. And so we're like, okay, well, what do we do basically? And
To make money.
yeah, we need to make money. We don't want to be as tied to just the ad markets, which there's a whole bunch of supply that just flooded the market and that brought down ad rates. And what we ended up doing is we saw live streaming as our feature. And so live streaming, one to many live streams, so you have one person talking to people who join. And in China, it was already incredibly popular. And so we were watching a site, an app called Momo, and so we saw them building. We're like, if we can make this work for the West in the US, like that could be really interesting. So we figured out how to kind of adapt it to so that could work for users. And it wasn't something that was like, Twitch was around, but even Twitch doesn't monetize through gifting in the same way. And so basically, as a viewer, you're sending the streamer gifts. The streamer gets a portion of that gift revenue, as does the company. And what it makes it so that, which is interesting from like a monetization standpoint, is that a lot of monetization features kind of hurt engagement because like they're paywalls or something like that. But with live streaming, what was interesting about it was it actually helped the content because then the streamers were going to create better content. They were motivated to create better content. And of course, we built up our whole talent team and our whole everything that the company built up to support that hadn't existed before. And so, I kind of mentioned before, the qualifications are overrated when we were starting as high schoolers, but that was true throughout our history. It's like there was no live streaming expert. We had to become live streaming experts. There was no guidebook for how to moderate live streams. We had to figure out how do we make those decisions because that's a huge decision. You're finding yourself in meetings and you're talking about very serious things like obviously keeping teenage users off the site and things like that. But then there's also things like, can someone eat a popsicle on the live stream? What other phallic objects should we not allow? And it sounds like a silly question, but it's an answer you need to, but it's things you need to answer because it's not hard to find awful content on even YouTube or even like
Yeah.
Twitch. It's pretty easy. And so we didn't want to be that. We wanted to make sure that we created those moderation capabilities to go with it. But to do that, you had to answer questions that there were no answers to. While I was there, we also published a transparency report to try to share with the outer industry, like, this is what we're doing. This is where we think others should be. So that way others could share what they were doing too. Cause there needs to be a lot of communication on those aspects of business to grow because, it's safety isn't a differentiating factor. It should be the table stakes. Like, so that we always had to develop. And so as we grew, so then we had live streaming as a whole thing. We acquired a whole bunch of apps to become the Meet Group. And we did that because we believed in live streaming. We were like, if we putting all these resources in it, let's have a bigger reach. Let's get other apps that are like ours and become a bigger company. And so that's what we did with our acquisitions. And then we were eventually acquired in 2020 to the parent company of eHarmony. It's a large German company, but the eHarmony was to be the most known brand in the US in a $500 million deal. And so that brought us back private. And And so then it was like another different thing when we were also working on our B2B business, which we had just started, excuse me, right before that acquisition. And so I left in 2023. And I think that the people that I worked with, a lot of the had people that were there for a very long time. We had fantastic retention, especially compared to tech industry. And I think part of it is people were respected and everyone had this curiosity, wanting to learn, wanting to be on the working on the next cutting edge things. And so I think that's why we kind of grew together. And so all through all these different phases of the company, we had our team to really rely on and really be supported by.
That's incredible. I think it's a testament to the leadership as well. I mean, people always say it. People don't leave companies, they leave managers. And so I'm sure the way that you hired, you were ruthless about hiring managers or executive leaders that would hire other great middle managers who would hire great individual contributors. Like it really does start at the top and with the core founding team as well. With the core founding team, you set the cultural DNA. Again, like the value system, like you said, that is going to be pervasive throughout the entire organization. So I'm sure totally a testament to what you and your brother collectively decided, this is the who of who we want to make up Meet Me at the time. But I would love to get back to you were very young and you were hiring people senior to you, and you're one of the youngest people in an organization you owned, which is so anomalous. We get a lot of people on this show who have very early entrepreneurial itches and they'll start businesses very young, but it's very rare that they go public or they have such a media presence so young. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit to that because I think that in and of itself is a way that you are a very vulnerable person in that position. You're not just a woman, but you're a young woman flying to different parts of the world, being subject to media scrutiny. Tell us a little bit more about that because I think that's so unique and in a lot of ways, I'm sure so challenging.
Especially when it came to so when we were first public, Yahoo Finance message boards were always buzzing, and there was photos of me on my yearbook profile. Obviously, there's photos of me, and there's a photo of me at my cousin's wedding, so I'm wearing a nice dress. And some of the day traders, I guess, took that photo, posted, and started making vulgar comments. And I was 21. It was absolutely disgusting. And things like that were common on those message boards. Obviously, if you go into message boards, like it's like the worst of the internet. You would hope that finance ones were different. They weren't. No, of course not. They were just awful. And it of course, is hurtful and disgusting, but it's also, like you said, like, by age. And what really helped me get through that wasn't just, "I'm not going to listen to that," or whatever. It was really just that I had another woman in my company reach out and say, "Hey, I see you. That's not okay." Yeah, and kinda talk to me about some of her experiences going through her career because she was a little bit older than me, and she told me, like, how she navigated it. And being able to have someone reach out and kinda take me under her wing was incredibly helpful for dealing with that because it is a lot of pressure. Where it was difficult was definitely dealing with investors or sometimes dealing with outsiders. I remember one activist investor was questioning Jeff, and he was trying to drill into like, why am I involved with the company? But he wasn't talking about me. He was like alluding to my title, which I'm actually not sure if Jeff knew what my official title was at the company at the time. It was like VP of brand strategy or something. And, we weren't very title centric. So that wasn't something we would talk about. But Jeff, when he realized what the question was, he's like, "Are you talking about my sister and co founder of this company?" And so he, took it right back to like, of course she's doing this. When you would have those, it's one thing to defend yourself, but when someone else defends you, it's
Yeah.
that much more powerful, and then you're able to realize and have the confidence, like, I belong at this table.
Yeah.
Even though I might be a decade younger or something like that, I still belong here.
And I think it's so critical too, because in both of those examples, the woman who reached out to you was older. She had more tenure, even though it's funny because you hired her. She was older. So in a lot of ways, the power dynamic was she was someone who had a lot of credibility in that situation. Same with your brother. Unfortunately, he may have not been that much older than you, but he was a male. And
Oh, he was 10 years older too.
yeah, okay. So he was 10 years older. Again, so it's great to have people who while it's easy sometimes to want to alienate people with more privilege than you in certain situations, to the extent that they can be allies, that is incredibly powerful for you because they're going to be able to have leverage with their words in a way that you just can't. In a moment like that, I'm sure you were almost shocked into submission. I love when people are always questioning women like, why didn't you say anything? And sometimes it's when these things are happening to you, it's an outer body experience. You don't even have words. You're literally shocked into submission. And so to have somebody else with a little more agency in the situation come and speak on your behalf is so critical. So I've always been a big, strong male allies, strong whomever in the industry has a little bit more credibility or leverage or just privilege rather than othering people like that. If they're being helpful to invite them in,
Yeah.
they can be your biggest advocates.
Yes. And, I think that's it's something you said before. Like, yes, even though I was in this system, like hiring people, like when it came to finding who your mentors are, your mentor doesn't have to be someone who, well, first of all, I have a lot to say about mentors because I think that no, there's no like unicorn mentor for most people. What you want to look for instead is people that can kind of guide you when you need to be guided. And so that's going to be, when I turn to the woman in my company to help me with those specific issues, or like my brother, or huge mentor of mine for different things, and even like my peers, even in people in completely different industries. It's finding parts of your stories that align and that can support each other. And what's amazing with working with people too, and just advocating for others, because back then, yeah, I had some power, but your power increases as your career goes, and then you're able to say no to things that you didn't used to be able to say no to. It's a privilege that you don't really recognize it unless you think, oh, right, I didn't used to be able to say, no, I'm not going to take that opportunity because of this. You used to have to be like, I need to say yes to everything. It's different as you get older, or as you get more experience, and you have that power. But what you find that when you begin advocating for others is that it brings you up too. And when we mentioned before, like sometimes it's because of the scarcity, like there can be situations where people didn't want to stick your neck out for you. And that's awful, but it's also not supported by research. The research,
Yeah.
when you advocate for someone else, when you're trying to get something good to happen for someone else, when you say, "Hey, did you hear this great idea that they had?" and you amplify their ideas, you look good too.
Yeah.
The impression people have of you makes people more likely want to work with you as well. So if everyone can just take into their workplaces that want to amplify, that want to help, and to kind of have like the no strings attached, like it's going to bring everyone up.
Yeah, Catherine, you and I talked about this. It was funny. I was talking to my husband about this notion of how creating accessibility for one group of people creates accessibility for everybody, right? There is this perceived threat. And you talk about this in chapter 13 of your book, which I was privileged enough to be able to read in advance. There is this perceived threat that if a marginalized group gets some level of accommodation, it is going to require a sacrifice from another group of people. And that's just largely untrue. And yeah, when you kind of create like an education, it's called universal design, everybody wins. And one of the examples I think of this, you talked about, I think, lactation tents at a marathon for women, for athletes who are breastfeeding. I thought of it during my time at Facebook. Facebook was incredibly accessible place, especially for new mothers. And they had lactation rooms, like rooms where you could breastfeed as a woman. And nobody was slighted by it. Yes,
Yeah.
maybe there was a couple instances where when we were short on conference rooms, sometimes people would want to take advantage of the mother rooms to use them as conference rooms, but then they'd be ushered to no, use
Right.
another room. But it is funny. I think people get this idea. They have this preconceived notion that it's going to threaten them. I think about this not to get too political, but I think about this when it comes to the idea of gender neutral bathrooms. I
Mhm.
know the idea of gender neutral bathrooms makes a lot of people very upset. But when you go to a gender neutral bathroom and there's two of them, what does that mean? That means shorter lines in both bathrooms for both
At this,
sets of people, for all people. And, but again, talking about it, certain people get so heated, but the practicality of it when you're actually confronted with it, it's like, oh,
right.
everybody can acknowledge this is actually just a way better system in general. Catherine, why do you think certain people, and I'll admit to this too, there's certain ways that I can kind of think that something might be challenging or create scarcity for one group of people. Why does our mind go there? Why are we afraid of universal design and sometimes creating access for everybody?
I mean, I think that we just kind of default to panic mode. And so, oh, something is changing. I don't like that. Let me push back on that. Some of it has to do with messaging too. In my book, I talk about how a lot of the DEI backlash partially was because how it was handled in a lot of organizations is actually through anti-harassment trainings, things like that. It's actually shown to actually be worse for DEI than actually thinking of the actual actions that are being taken. It's not, I think when you think of the actual actions, like, oh, just the same bathroom. And now, hey, there's a whole pooling principle thing. Like there's no longer a huge line. That's fantastic. But that's a solid action that, whereas when it's talking about the principles, people feel, I think they panic when they don't understand what the repercussions are. And I mentioned this too, like men are, and there's a fantastic article by in Bloomberg about this recently too. But it was like men think that DEI initiatives like that hurt,
Yeah.
and they don't realize their privilege is still intact. And like, there's a one study that showed women within STEM fields have to have a 4.0 GPA to have the same level of interest as men who have 3.75. One group can start rising up. It doesn't mean that that you're affected. It just means that everyone has to work together and listen to each other and see, okay, well, what are the actual actions we can take to create the diverse workforce? So lactating women have a place, or or people that are lactating have a place that they can do that. And a lot of this is, once you actually think about, like, oh, that's actually not that hard. Let's do that. I have to plug my friend Tiffany Yu's book, Anti-Ableist Manifesto, and that just came out today, literally today.
Mm,
But I interviewed Tiffany in my book, and one of the things that she talks about is, like, there's accommodations versus there's accessibility, and accommodations is putting that band-aid on at the end, being like, oh, let's try to fix it a little bit. And accessibility is just thinking, as you're building new spaces, how can we make it so that we center the right people? Men have been centered so much in how everything has been structured. And now it's not so much that so let's say, let's center women. Like, that's great. Let's center women. Sure. But just in general, rethinking how everything is structured will help everyone, because when you think about, like, parental leave and things like that, men want it too. Men of this generation want it too. If we can think of, like, what everyone needs at and center more needs there, then you can create an environment where people can go in and just feel like they belong and feel like they can give their best, because they're not holding back a piece of them because they're not comfortable, or because they know that a part of them will make them othered. And
right.
so if you can create an environment and make it more accessible from the start, then you're going to welcome more diverse talent. And there's been so many studies that show, if you have diverse talent, your company's going to do better.
100%. Yeah. Even just from, again, if we just go back to practicality, which I think a lot of
Mhm.
people think these things are impractical, DEI is impractical, creating accessibility is impractical. There's substantive research that says if you hire diversely, you have less bias in product. You have just less erroneous features. Things just get checked and diverse perspectives get accounted for, which is so much better for that to happen before you launch your product out into the ether, and then you get a lot of backlash, right? Because
Right.
something was missed.
Right.
Oh, another thing I'll say is I do think that it's really important to acknowledge one's own privilege in a situation, even with universal design, even if we're coming into spaces where everything feels very equitable. I generally find that when people are afraid of change, it's because they themselves feel a sense of lack. They themselves feel as though they're already missing out
Mhm.
and they're going to miss out more. I feel that the people, I'll say it more broadly, the men in my life who don't feel threatened by women's success generally are men who are very understanding of their own privilege in a situation. And I think that's good because and this isn't true of, I mean, there's a broad spectrum and there's so much intersectionality. It's more than just gender, there's race and everything. But I think when you can acknowledge, and I do this myself too, the amount of privilege you carry in any given situation, because let's not neutralize that. Everybody carries privilege in a given situation.
Mhm.
Once you honor that, I feel like you can get a little bit more comfortable because you do have so much that you're not really, even if conceivably you did have to sacrifice a little bit, you'd still be operating with so much.
Right.
And I think where I do see a lot of that fear and fear of change come from is when people feel like they're already having things taken away from them left and right. But if you acknowledge that you actually have a lot of things already afforded to you, maybe that liberates you a little bit from some of that fear.
Right, right. I think it does. A lot of times too, it's like, so we're talking about like, well, what doesn't work. One of the things that does work for increased DI and things like that is flexibility in your work. So being able to have flex time, being able to, maybe work remotely. Those are things that everyone found out how much they benefited by
In the
in
COVID.
the COVID. And that was something that had been completely closed off as an option. And now you find out, oh, if we can create a flexible workplace, then we're actually going to keep more people and it benefits everyone because it doesn't just benefit you if you have, say, you're in the sandwich generation, you're caring for like an older relative as well as like a child or something like that, where you might need some flexibility because of that. It also benefits you if you're driving to work and your brake light goes on or,
Right.
something like that, or you need to go to the doctor's appointment. Everyone needs some amount of flexibility and you might need different flexibility than someone else does. But being able to figure out like how to build workplaces that honor that, those are the types of changes that can make a huge impact and that really do help everyone. But there's like the fear of like, well, this is how we always did it. So this is how we need to do it again. And that's just not a good reason for doing anything.
And it does create a little bit of that abundance mindset in everybody. If everybody's being afforded something great that gives them more time, more flexibility, yeah, I just feel like we're less likely to feel abrasively towards other people. And again, I think you were a testament to that in the way that you built your company. I mean, everybody there was treated with a certain degree of dignity and kindness, and it made for less combative workspaces. I mean, I know a lot of corporate environments where that's absolutely not the case. So, yeah, we see the proof in the pudding time and time again. So I'm so glad that you are speaking openly about the way that you ran your company. And I know you get a lot more into this into your book, Designing Success. So, Catherine, this book is actually, by the time this episode airs, it's going to be out in paperback and
Yes.
audio. So
Yeah.
I would
Or
love.
paperback and ebook. Audiobook will be coming in April. I'm staggering it
Okay.
a little bit.
Okay. Well, they can listen to this podcast on repeat until the audio version comes out if they
Yes.
want like an aperitif. But I would love for you to clue our audiences a little bit more into what they can expect of Designing Success. Tell us a little bit about it and then where folks can purchase it if they so choose.
Yeah. So designing success is basically lessons I've learned through my 20 years building as a female tech entrepreneur. And so I go into things that will help you design your own life in a way that supports your actual goals versus the goals of like what society has said it should be. So it's kind of a way to really defeat burnout. So, for instance, how to set boundaries more effectively, how to be a more efficient decision maker, how to engineer serendipity and foster connections with the people, how to create more time in your day. And so it's really just about, through my lens of entrepreneurship, figuring out like how can we all create the life that we actually want. And it was a lot of fun to write. I found out I love writing when I was doing it. So yeah, Designing Success will be on Amazon, Barnes& Noble, all of the, where you get your books.
So exciting. I can't wait. I'm going to be that person that goes to Barnes and Noble and I'm going to or I'm going to find the book and then I'm going to put it at the storefront. Like I'm going to put it at the front of one of the display areas.
Oh,
I
actually, I
think
should
it's
say, barnesandnoble.com. But actually, yeah, to get your book into bookstores, you need to request like each individual bookstore. It's not like Barnes& and Noble, like corporate. You have to like go to each Barnes& and Noble and like be like, can you list my book? So if you want to ask your Barnes& and Noble to carry Designing Success, that would be great.
perfect. That's where I'll be. And I think it's so timely. This is the perfect time for this book because I know a lot of people in corporate right now are dealing with burnout. It's really tough too because it's an incredibly hard job market. So a lot of folks feel that they don't have agency to speak up for themselves in their corporate environments. So a lot of people just feel incredibly stuck. And I don't think it could be a better time for a book like this to enter into someone's life.
Thank you.
Well, Catherine, this has been such an incredible conversation, but I expected nothing less of you. We know where to find the book. If folks want to get in touch
Oh,
with
yeah.
you individually to speak with you about anything else, learn from your experience, is there a way that they can best reach out?
Yeah. So my website, cconnelly.me. So CCONNELLY.me. And I also do virtual office hours about once a month. And so I'm happy to connect with more people. But yeah, that's the best place to find me.
I'm sure we'll have folks taking advantage. Well, Catherine, thank you so much for giving all that you give and all you've continued to give throughout the years. This has been such an amazing conversation. So thank you again so much. And thank you for being such an advocate of the show. This wasn't a micro moment of kindness. This was a huge act of kindness. And I'm forever, forever grateful for it.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking with you and I loved the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Marginal Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the team at CalPal with music by Siddhartha. If you like what you heard today, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can view full episode show notes at marginalpodcast.com and follow us at Marginal Podcast on Instagram. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.